I'm Debbie Georgatos. Welcome to my show, America, Can We Talk? Today, we're going to talk about a New York City panel coming out with the idea that rewarding achievement is white supremacy. And then Katherine Kersten of the Center of the American Experiment joins me to talk about public school and racial chaos. And last is exposing reporters' private lives, fair game. And finally, of course, I'll tell you why these stories matter to you. Stay tuned.
I am America.
Debbie Georgatos, host of America Can We Talk, is an author, attorney, and political analyst whose mission is to inspire the American political conversation about preserving liberty in the best country on earth.
Hello again and welcome to America Can We Talk? I'm Debbie Georgatos. In today's First Five, I want to tell you about a panel in New York City, a panel appointed by Mayor de Blasio, which is called the New York City School Diversity Advisory Group, that issued their report recently about what to do about the great racial disparities in the public school system in New York City, essentially saying that more children, there's not equality or equity between the racial composition of the city and the racial composition of especially some of the higher academic courses, even starting as young as kindergarten. What they basically are saying is this advisory committee and this plan has not been adopted, but the advisory committee has said to the mayor and the city that the city should get rid of academic screening in elementary, middle, and high schools because the selective schools have disproportionately more white and Asian students. The basic track they're talking about, or one of them, is the Gifted and Talented program, which many school districts have around the country. It's essentially, at least in New York City, it involves screening children as young as kindergarten and getting them into faster track education because of their how they perform in those tests. So they, as an example of how it is seriously racially disproportionate in New York City's Gifted and Talented program. The program is made up of 42% of Asian students, 39% of white students, and 10% Hispanic, and only 8% of African American. However, African American and Hispanic students make up 70% of the city's kindergartners. So it's a great racial disparity. The report is basically saying there's no reason to have these kind of gifted and talented programs any longer, or at least that they're trying to achieve in all the public schools in New York City, essentially racial equity, meaning the composition of any school should generally reflect the racial composition of the surrounding community. There shouldn't be broad differences between the racial composition in a city, in a particular school, and in the surrounding area. There was one thing I want to point to, and it's what I labeled this segment about what they are talking about, white supremacy. There is staff training material given out by the city's Department of Education, and this idea in this slide, I'll talk about in just a moment, but the slide basically talks about the idea that you can find one way to detect or see what white supremacy is. You can find white supremacy as perfectionism, a sense of urgency, worship of the written word, objectivity. There is an ideology, this is again the New York City Department of Education, that equates the constituent component for excellence and for human performance, students' achievement, as being effectively white supremacy. Clearly, some groups are not in agreement with this. Max Eden, one person from the Manhattan Institute, is basically saying this idea put forth by this commission in New York City is not right. He says even though current standardized tests used to select students may need some reform, the educational policy trend in New York City reflects a deeper problem. In his words, the integration argument is not really what's at work here. What's at work is a kind of identity politics logic that all disparities must be the product of discrimination. And so he's basically saying, are we really going to agree that all of the disparity in the composition of kids succeeding in entering into gifted and talented programs must be due to discrimination versus other factors? He also adds that doesn't just say that we should just close the achievement gap by lifting people from the bottom up, but in New York City, he's saying it's unfair that people who are doing well are seen as being unfair, and so we have to tear them down too. These are really serious questions, and we're going to dedicate today's show mostly to education and what the public schools do in this country to deal with the disparities both in academic performance as well as in discipline when they deal with statistical outcomes, statistical facts that show, for example, that minority students have a statistically higher likelihood of being engaging in conduct that lead to discipline in schools as compared with their counterparts of white and Asian students. And it's a really, really tough problem. I want to talk about it thoroughly and thoughtfully and sensitively, but we also have to recognize that solutions like this, and I will get at the end of the show and tell you why I think the New York City solution is off base, but solutions like this really don't end up helping anyone. They certainly punish the achievers, but they don't really do much to help the kids who need more help, whose lives are impacted by all sorts of factors outside of school that get them to the point where they're not able to perform as well as their counterparts or engage in disciplinary or are the recipients of discipline because of their conduct in school. So that's today's First Five. We're going to talk about education today and really what the policies are that could and should be put in place to deal with racial disparities in our public education system, both in academic performance and in discipline. And joining me today to talk about these issues is a woman we've had on the show before, Katherine Kersten. She's in Minnesota. She is one of the founding members of the Center of the American Experiment, one of the most just stellar, extraordinary state-based think tanks in this country in Minneapolis. She's a writer, she's an attorney, she's currently a senior policy fellow at the Center of the American Experiment, but she was also a founding director and served as the chair of the Center of the American Experiment from 1996 to 1998. She's a widely published author. She has spoken in all sorts of very prominent places. She's a former columnist for the Star Tribune, and she is joining us online today. So I believe we have Katherine Kersten online. Hi, Katherine.
Hi, Debbie. Great to be with you.
Great to have you. Thank you so much for coming on. I was reading your resume. You've really been published in Wall Street Journal, Weekly Standard, Christianity Today, all sorts of great shows, Hugh Hewitt, Glenn Beck, Laura Ingraham. So I love that you're actively engaged in policy discussions on this very, very tender issue. So I just want to jump right in. I'm going to go back and maybe ask you your thoughts about the New York City desegregation plan or proposed plan. But I'm going to start with something that's happening in Minnesota. In the great state of Minnesota, which I think I've told you before, I love Minnesota. We spent all of our summers, I spent all of our summers growing up there. I really, have great fondness, a lot of family there. But you wrote a piece, it was in the March 2018 Star Tribune, the Minneapolis Star Tribune, about a proposal that was being made by the Minnesota Department of Human Rights, MDHR, which essentially is sending out letters to public schools in Minnesota addressing their statistical disparity in disciplining students. And so I want to ask you, you kind of launched a big discussion about this, and I want to ask you to start with, what was the reason you were not supportive of this Minnesota Department of Human Rights letters to school districts essentially announcing they're under investigation because their student discipline records show disproportionate punishment of minority students?
Well, of course, there are so many problems, as you've already pointed out, with regard to what's happening now in New York City. So many problems that come from founding your educational philosophy on the notion that what matters most is a child's race or ethnicity versus that child's abilities and needs as an individual human being. The kind of program we see that the Minnesota Department of Human Rights pushing on our public schools here is flawed in a fundamental way, because it assumes that the cause of the racial discipline gaps we see here in Minnesota and across the country is racist teachers and discipline policies, not differing rates of student misconduct. And of course, evidence completely flies in the face of that, and an attempt to equalize discipline rates among groups that can come from such different family backgrounds, etc., is going to have the effect of harming the very students you're trying to help by creating disorder, which is the result of the depletion of real meaningful consequences for student misconduct, and of course lowering behavior expectations. And that is what happened in the St. Paul public schools here in an attempt to erase the racial discipline gap several years ago. Now our Department of Human Rights is trying to extend that failed experiment across the entire state of Minnesota.
So, Katherine, one point I want to be clear on: you don't dispute the statistics that show that there tends to be a higher rate of discipline issued against black students in Minnesota than against white and other racial groups. I mean, the data is not. You're not disputing the data.
No.
It's the reasoning behind it, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. And these figures, as I said, are greatly disparate, not only here in Minnesota, but essentially in every state in the union.
Yeah, they really are. Well, you mentioned the Minnesota experiment. I was going to go back and talk about that because you wrote so eloquently about that several times and have spoken about it so often. And, I guess I want to get at first, you pointed out in this piece that you had in the is it Minneapolis Star Tribune? Is that what it is?
Yes,
yeah.
Right, yeah.
Minneapolis Star Tribune, this piece where you pointed out that it was a bad idea for the Minnesota Department of Human Rights to be essentially threatening school districts, saying, your disciplinary stats look bad and we're going to investigate you unless you change them. So they're basically trying to force the schools to change statistics so that somehow the discipline rate is more aligned with the proportionality of the student population. And you're saying that's not really the way to solve the problem. But
right.
Yeah.
And I'm saying that they are blaming the discipline gap, the racial gap, on racist teachers and discipline policies. They don't seem to be concerned about the fact that boys are disciplined across the nation much more often than girls. And nationally, white boys are suspended at more than twice the rate of Asian and Pacific Islander boys. If you follow their logic, that's because teachers are biased against white students and biased against boys, which we know they don't believe. So even these kinds of very fundamental logical inconsistencies do not trouble them as they forge ahead with this ideological view of the causes of differences in racial discipline rates. And again, when you put these kinds of policies in place that attempt to equalize racial discipline rates by lowering expectations of behavior and removing consequences, you hurt the very children you're trying to help. Because what results is disorderly classrooms where minority kids who come prepared or desiring to learn find that it's an incredible uphill battle because you can't learn in a chaotic environment.
Yeah, I love I couldn't agree with you more. I love what you wrote. You wrote in great depth about the experiment that was engaged in the Edina public schools in outside Minneapolis, in which involved one particular new administrator who decided she was going to try to impose racial equity, to get to the idea that there should be racial equity in all these measures of behavior. So the answer must be to either change what constitutes poor behavior, just dumb down standards, or just simply allow the behavior and not have significant punishments. Can you elaborate on what happened? That was a 4 or 5 year period in Edina, which you cataloged?
Well, actually, that was in the St. Paul public schools, and you're exactly right. It was this policy of essentially insisting that racial discipline rates had to be the same for all groups led to complete disaster in the St. Paul public schools. There were such an increase in threats against teachers, for example, and threats to the safety of teachers, that we saw teachers leaving, retiring early, crying out in letters to a St. Paul paper columnist that they felt they were fearful in school. One teacher in particular was beaten by a student and sustained a permanent traumatic brain injury, teachers who had to literally lock the doors and give secret access codes to students who had to come in late because they were so fearful of the gangs of unruly kids who were roaming the halls, and not sustaining any consequences because, of course, you simply can't discipline students of certain racial backgrounds. And lots of minority families fled the St. Paul public schools because they had kids who wanted to learn and couldn't do so in that terrible environment.
There's also the same administrator who made this big change in this St. Paul area school district, Edina School District. She tried to change, as you mentioned, alluded to in the beginning, but I want to focus a little more on it. She tried to change the focus of who's the source of the problem. Is it the students who are misbehaving, or, as she would have argued, it was the parents or the teachers and administrators who were just insensitive and not aware. So she was requiring teachers to get more sensitivity training. And I thought some of the things you wrote about were just amazing. That teachers were essentially told the behavior that you are not and that you don't want is really you have the problem because you can't tolerate the way these kids are trained or grew up or behave.
Yeah, and you see this increasing across the nation, the so-called cultural competence requirements for teachers. The idea that kids are misbehaving because you, as a teacher, don't understand their home culture, and therefore, if they can scream at the dinner table, at home, you have to understand that that's their culture, and therefore you have to teach them in a way that somehow allows that to happen. I also talked to another teacher recently, a physics teacher, high school physics teacher, not in either one of the school districts you mentioned, who said that there were a number of African American consultants brought into her school, and they lectured the teachers about how they must change their teaching. In her physics class, she was told that in order for African American students to perform well, they had to be taught about some pharaoh in Egypt, supposedly, who measured pyramids or something. And she objected, no, I'm a physics teacher. That's not how kids learn physics. But she was be told there that in this incredibly racist way, ironically, that this is the only way these children could learn.
Well, that actually, I'm glad you used the word racist, because I want to mention something about that. One of the points in the article you made was the idea that teachers and administrators had to be retrained to comply with this new system that this administrator in Edina School has put in place. And she used examples like they learn like shouting out answers in class as opposed to raising, or lack of punctuality. These are considered black cultural traits, and that what may seem to be a defiant student behavior is just a culturally conditioned expression of enthusiasm. And that's what I want to get to. Even if that is true, that nothing is true of every single member of any race, but even if it was true that a majority of black students came from homes where you don't raise your hand, or just you yell out, you're disruptive, and you're late, what is the value of a school reinforcing or legitimizing that behavior as though that behavior will somehow aid that student in functioning later in life?
Well, that is such an important observation. This, as I said, is harming the very children who are supposed to be the beneficiaries. How are children who are told that they are being victimized on the basis of skin color if they punch the kid in the desk next to them, how are they going to grow up to become self-disciplined, productive citizens? How are they going to hold a job? How are they going to keep a family together? Schools are, in some cases, are the one place where disadvantaged kids can find an orderly environment where they can learn the tools of success. But if they're told that those tools are racist in themselves, as you point out, Max Eden says in the article about the New York City plan, then they're doomed to failure. It's a tragedy.
It's a tragedy, and I know there is something. I mean, it's all of what the advocates for this kind of adjusted school standards and adjusted behavioral standards and diminishing punishment, The underlying argument is essentially that because the statistics show that black students are more likely to be disciplined than white or Asian students are, that the only possible explanation is racism. But I actually think it's racist to assume that the common cultural standards of punctuality, conducting yourself in class by raising your hand and waiting until you're called on, conducting yourself in an orderly manner in the hallway, not disrupting classes, all the behavior that just got worse and worse and worse under these lax standards, it's actually racist to assume that because of a student's skin color, they can't learn and benefit from that. You agree?
Oh, I couldn't agree more. Again, it is so irresponsible of our public school administrators to be pushing this truly racist line, and it guarantees failure for the minority students who buy into that as they go forward in life.
Absolutely. So in the Edina schools, to wrap up on them, I believe I read from what I pulled down today, in the Edina schools, the administrator who had pushed this whole shift, not permitting discipline, just dumbing down discipline standards, not permitting punishment, she was eventually forced out by the school board, because parents and community members voted in a new school board that says this has to stop. Is that essentially right?
Yes. Yes, yeah, the St. Paul Public Schools, that's right. This kind of thing has also been going on in Edina, but what you're talking about there is the St. Paul Public Schools. And what was remarkable was that effort was led by the teachers union, that an effort to get rid of this school administrator. So that's heartening, I think, to see that it is possible under some circumstances to push back against this trend. But again, the tragedy is that this very failed experiment is now being imposed across the state of Minnesota by our Department of Human Rights, which claims that our Minnesota Human Rights Act requires racial discipline rates to be proportional to students' proportions within the school populations.
So where does it stand? I saw this is an article, I think, from March of 2018. They sent a notice out to 43 school districts and charter schools saying essentially, you don't have racial equity. So are the school districts just surrendering, or are they fighting back?
Yep, pretty much they are surrendering. And when you think about what it's like to have the State Department of Human Rights come after you and sue you in a court, and it embarrass you publicly in front of parents by claiming that you're racist, etc. Most of these school districts just don't have the resources or the guts to stand up and challenge this. 2 of the 43 have done so, and that is very encouraging. But they face a juggernaut, and they have had, all these districts have had to sign policies that, say that they will change the way that they discipline, and in many cases the way they teach, in order to equalize racial discipline rates.
It's such a tragedy. I know I'm going back to a point I made, but it's such a tragedy for the children, for the children who come from homes where they don't have adequate supervision, training, education, so they arrive at school not acculturated to behave in a way we do in America in public schools, and for the children who do know, minority children, children of any race or ethnicity, their school experience is disrupted and in some way diminished by the poor conduct of other students, and the school can't get after the misbehaving ones, so they're harmed by it. It just seems like there's the only thing really winning is kind of the strident, intellectual, relentless argument that America's filled with racism, and the explanation for anything that seems at all off base must be racism. And at the end of the day, they're hurting all of the students at those schools.
Yes, this is exactly right. And as you point out, Max Eden makes this point about the New York City schools, that all of these behaviors that are simple common sense steps toward a successful, self-disciplined, productive life are now being relabeled as white supremacy, as a function of white privilege. And there's a nihilism here. There's almost a kind of urge to suicide as a nation, and when you push such remarkably silly and clearly illogical points of view.
They really are. I want to go, Katherine, your piece in the Minnesota paper brought some opposition. People wrote back in to criticize your piece that was essentially saying the Minnesota Department of Human Rights was off base in what they were trying to do. And actually, as I read both of them, I noticed both of the counterpoints I happened to read. One observation was none of them, neither of these two people who were so irate at your viewpoint, were denying in any way the examples you gave, the many examples you gave in your piece of poor behavior leading to danger to the teachers, to the schools. No one's denying the problem exists. One of them was essentially saying that because you put it out there publicly, some of the public school teachers who must follow the policies were being are being threatened or criticized. And I was struck by neither of them could really refute the logic of what you're saying.
Well, yeah, and I'm sure you know this, Debbie, that a careful, logical argumentation is not the strategy that America's left uses today. This is all about emotion. It's all about labeling your opponents as racist and bigots in an attempt to shut down the conversation. Because their success, I think, really rides on people's buying their general theory, which is that America is divided into two kinds of people, the oppressors and the oppressed. And they claim to be the self-righteous, morally enlightened people who can lead us forward through this darkness that we exist in now to a utopian future with this kind of radical equality, which we know is impossible and is based on a lie.
Absolutely. And, it's interesting. I say, Katherine, you're singing my song. I'm on this point all the time about, the ability to argue through any one of hundreds of issues, present facts, look back and forth, compare the outcomes of facts, the details, and get to some logical decision about policy. It is not a discussion that happens very often in this country on not just race, on not just education, but many issues. You toe the left-wing line, or they'll tell you which label you get to have: racist, xenophobic, hateful, bigoted, something bad. I'm going to go one more point, though, that I thought was interesting from these critics, and that was this. One of the critics of your opposition to this effort to reintroduce the racial equity system was making the point that the only reason there is a disparity in the behavior of black students in public schools is due to essentially the history of white privilege, the fact that there's a wealth gap in this country, the disparity in rates of home ownership, all these disparities between black and white Americans. And my thought was, even if every bit of data he has and believes in wholeheartedly is true, even if, there is obviously, historically, we had slavery, we had segregation, we had that. There's a history in our country. And it is accurate, I believe, that there's a lower rate of home ownership among black Americans and white, for example. But what is the therefore he's getting to? And therefore we just surrender to poor behavior,
right,
to violent behavior? Isn't the answer, if that's what you think America is, wouldn't you be fighting for the kids to get the best possible, good
right,
quality, high education?
Yes, and of course you're right about slavery, without a doubt. But I think some very negative consequences for African Americans have flowed from the welfare state, from the fact that the link between work, hard, real effort, and economic prosperity has been broken. In particular, the falling apart of the African American family. So they may talk about slavery, but they don't talk about the incredible differences in family structure on average between African American and white families. So today you've got 72% of African American children, 66% of Native American children born out of wedlock, as opposed to 29% of white kids and 17% of Asian children. These are the kinds of underlying disparities created by certain cultural assumptions or choices that figure very prominently in these disparities that we're talking about. They're simply never acknowledged, though, by people on the left, and they're very important.
Oh, they are, and I know you and others at the Center of the American Experiment have written about that, and we've talked about that on the show, too. It's so much easier if you're a leftist and every solution is big government to focus on something government can do. Government can't, I mean, in fact, the left-wing policies that have increased dependency on the government have actually contributed to the decline of the American family, contributed to the percentage of kids being raised in single-parent homes with no fathers around. And there's just a plethora of data that show that young children being raised in a single-parent home without a dad are far more likely to drop out of high school, get arrested, join a gang, take drugs, end up in jail. There's no good statistic out of single-parent homes, and yet, but the reason the left can't talk about that is because they cannot propose a government solution to force a change. All they can do is kind of deal with the after the fact of what their policies have caused.
Right. Right. Yeah. So these kinds of themes recur across the whole spectrum of political issues, not just education. And that's, I think, one of the greatest challenges our nation faces today is to talk common sense on these kinds of issues to a group of people who don't want to hear common sense.
Yeah, common sense and kind of hard and tender truths that people aren't comfortable talking about, but they need to.
Yep. Right.
Well, Katherine, I love your organization, Center of the American Experiment. I'd love if you want to quickly tell our listeners how to find your organization and what you all do. I'd love to close our interview with that.
Great. Yes, so we're at www.americanexperiment.org. We are a state-based think tank. We cover policies across the spectrum from energy, economic policy, tax policy, to the kinds of cultural and educational issues that you and I are talking about today. And we are interested in, as you are, opening up the conversation on all these issues in a nation where it's increasingly difficult to be heard.
I love it. Love what you do. And that's one reason I do my show, is because I think there's so many issues that we can't talk about the real problem. Talking about the real solutions is very quickly cut down by many in the media because they don't want to talk about real solutions, and people get timid speaking up. I meant to also commend you for your bravery and tenacity, because the things you're saying are correct and accurate and brave, and there are a lot of people who find it easier, instead of responding to the substance of what it is you are saying, to just express disdain or name calling or belittling of your ideas. But you've just done a fabulous job focusing on this issue, and I want to commend you and thank you for your work.
Well, thank you, and I thank you as well for getting this message out to so many folks. It's wonderful work, and it's a privilege to be on the show.
Katherine, Kersten, thank you so much for joining me. And I'm telling you, folks, it's a great organization. What she's talking about, Center of the American Experiment, where she works, which she's a co-founder of, and her work on this issue of the racial equity mission of the American left to make somehow all discipline calculations, all academic performance calculations within schools be exactly replicative of or repetitive of the surrounding school area in the school district. So if an area is 30% black, only 30% of discipline should be, and 30% of every single measure should be, and it fails to address the left-wing, one-size-fits-all racial equity solutions actually end up hurting students of all backgrounds and don't solve the problem. So it's a great story, great issue to keep focusing on, because what she's talking about, and I'm going to leave alone the New York City story I talked about in the first 5, except to close to say on that story is, it is so much easier for left-wingers in this country to look at statistical disparities and make an argument that it must be due to racism, could not be due to any other factors. No one can talk about any other factors. No one can assess other factors. Anyone who even mentions other factors must be either racist, xenophobic, homophobic, or some other phobic. And so we shut down the discussion that would actually lead to solutions. So in New York City, the idea of cutting out gifted and talented programs because an insufficient number of people of a certain skin color happen to qualify for them really ends up hurting everyone and ultimately ends up hurting America. We don't reward the students who are achieving, working hard, and qualifying for those kinds of programs. So. And it's a great topic, and you know, this show is always about saving America and speaking up for America. It's a great window on the difference between left-wing thought and right-wing thought, which is, or the accurate thought on the right, which is you have to solve the real problems, understand the real issues. You can't just look at statistical disparities and say, okay, must be racism, and then impose a racial quota program to fix the problem. And we didn't even get into as much detail as we could have in the school districts that tried this in Minnesota, but they had horrific discipline problems for 4 years until they're finally able to eject this administrator who was forcing these programs on all these schools and ending up really harming, physically getting teachers harmed, harming the school, harming the school's performance. Everything fell apart during those years. It's just not a way to solve this kind of problem. And it's really it's a disservice to America's students and ultimately then to America, because we need these students to be well educated, finish school, get out of school, and become the shining star citizens we need them to be. The last story I want to hit for today, there was a story out that was related to the some allies of President Trump raising money. They have a goal of raising $2 million, and they want to use that money to target reporters on the American left who are endlessly attacking President Trump. And so they've talked about the idea of using conservative-friendly sources. They mentioned Breitbart, probably a bunch of other conservative websites and other sources to get information out about these reporters who are endlessly attacking President Trump, endlessly criticizing him, endlessly criticizing his policies. Just basically say, you know what, two can play at your game, reporters. If you're going to just tear down the president, dig for every bit of dirt you can find about everything in his life, dig for every bit of dirt about everyone around him, you know, two can play this game. We're going to go after your reporters. There have been, of course, this is a goal of $2 million they want to raise. They've already, they say, gathered the data. They have lots of information available for publication, but all sorts of reporters who spend their time trying to destroy conservative ideas, and especially President Trump. So you might imagine the left-wing media is not happy about this. They've been saying this is undignified, this is unacceptable, this is this hurts our First Amendment freedom, to freedom of the press. We can't be publishing things if you're going to be attacking our reporters. And so they're outraged. They're saying this is a terrible thing. This is a terrible sign for our disrespect for the media and disrespect for essentially the media's role to report to us. So I want to mention a couple points about this. One, it's really easy to get excited about this idea and think, great, I'm so sick of reading these clowns at Washington Post and New York Times, and all they ever do is trash President Trump and trash conservatives and attack the GOP and attack conservative ideas. All they ever do, finally someone's going to hold them to the same standards that they are holding the president and others about whom they report. It's a temptation to say, good, let them, they have it coming, go for it. I want to say that I do think that there is a tremendous loss of confidence in America, among Americans, in our media. That's like an understatement of the century. There's a huge loss of confidence on behalf of literally millions of Americans in what we used to think of as our basic sources of news. We had, before the internet came along, before talk radio came along, we had a very limited number of outlets. We had the television stations that had maybe the 3 major networks. You had a few big newspapers, and that small cabal of people controlled everything America thought and believed. It's truly amazing. You think about the power of ABC, NBC, CBS. Maybe you pick 5 big newspapers nationally. Before the internet and before the talk radio or podcasts like this, that tiny number of outlets, that small number of people, they controlled everything everyone thought and believed. What happened was the internet came along and talk radio burst on the scene, was that people had new sources of information. And the mainstream media, or what we called the mainstream media, had competition. They had to fight for people to listen to them. They had to say, hey, you know what, we're the ones you should be listening to. We're the ones that know, don't listen to the podcast, and don't listen to Limbaugh, and don't listen to talk radio. Listen to us. But they're fighting for your listening, for your ear, for you to tune into them to get your news. On top of that, we have many people within the media, and more so, in my estimation, the last 20 or 30 years, who have a left-wing bias but attempt to report news and present news to you as though they are genuinely aggressive journalists, as though they are genuinely journalists with integrity, determined to find the truth and report it to you. And so this is the source of much frustration. People want to think, if I pick up a newspaper, I should be getting journalism. I should be getting, an accurate, unbiased source telling me the news. I don't think there really is such a thing anymore. I don't think there is any one newspaper, one outlet that it can always be the accurate source of truth for everything. I think therefore, what people do now, and which infuriates, like the New York Times and Washington Post, and people who think that they're entitled to tell America what to believe, they can't believe they can't control these other sources. That frustrates them. This new effort by President Trump's allies to come up with $2 million, it'll probably be more because I think people are going to like this idea, of exposing the biases of people in the major networks, and now you include CNN, MSNBC, New York Times, Washington Post, all those left-wingers. You're going to start to see stories about who are these reporters. Who is the person who wrote that story? Who is the person who's telling us that this is the way to look at this issue? Even the editorial pieces, the opinion pieces. Who is this person? Because they are not necessarily going to tell you, look, I'm a lefty, I love Hillary, I really wanted her to win. They're not going to tell you that. They're going to pretend that they're reporting news to you. On the editorial pages, even with editorial pages, it is really almost impossible for people to figure out what is the bias, what is the angle, where are you coming from? So these people, Trump supporters, putting together $2 million, if they can get information out like, well, reporter XYZ in the Washington Post, you should know that his wife works for the Democrat Socialists of America. Or this reporter that is a allegedly neutral reporter at any newspaper around the country, any of the mainstream outlets, even on the internet, to have people letting you know who these people are, what their biases are, what their background is. If they form the Democrat Socialists of America on their college campus, that might impact how you see what they tell you, and it should. Or if they're related to somebody who is actually way in some left-wing cause or way in some right-wing cause. There is really a need for people to be able, it's a valuable service for people to be able to know the story I'm reading, the reporter I'm listening to, where are they coming from? Who are they? Why are they telling me these things? And so I think to that degree and along those lines, this is a great idea. Let Americans know who these people are who are giving you all this left-wing, a lot of it just, garbage, left-wing advocacy that is posing as journalism. Obviously, if these people get off on the tacky, digging in your personal life and running in, bringing personal behavior that's not relevant to anything, the attempt to embarrass reporters or silence reporters, that's not right. And I hope that doesn't happen. I hope the mission of this thing really is to just help you understand the biases that may be present in some of these people you're reading and hearing from. So to the extent they keep this on the tack of on the high road of just letting you know who these people are, what their background is, who they're married to, who they're affiliated with, you may, for example, want to know that somebody who's really, really deeply defending some business actually has a huge share in that business, or defending some country, actually has dealings with that country that'll impact their family's wealth, like Biden, for example. It's good to know. It's good to know those kinds of things exist. So I think it's a good thing. I don't want to go the trashy route, with the effort to try to just silence anyone who criticizes anything on the right. So I wanted to mention that because I think it's going to become a big thing. I think that the effort to expose reporters for who they are is going to become a big thing, and mostly it could be a good thing. And now I want to tell you, as I do at the end of every show, why the stories we talked about today matter to you. First, we had our story relating to the American education system, education policy. New York and Minnesota schools, they get it wrong when they make group identity the basis of education policy. That thinking is a form of tribalism. I'm going to be talking more about tribalism on this show the next, I don't know how long, but it's a form of tribalism. We divide people in tribes, and then we decide everything based on what tribe you're in, rather than the individual. America's founding ideals, all men and women are created equal, means one race, the human race. We need to all respect and cherish the value and potential of each individual child. End group identity mindset that dismisses individual worth and merit. Achievement, reward, discipline, and punishment should be evaluated and applied on an individual basis. Defining American education policy when inequality between races or ethnicities as to discipline or as to achievement, so as the Minnesota situation, discipline, or the New York City achievement, is shown, the answer is not to abandon discipline or to ignore or dumb down achievement. The answers include digging into the facts about cause of the performance or discipline bias to determine true causes and then deal with them. We do want to expose and expel racial bias where it's found. Help academically disadvantaged kids to catch up. Let achievers keep flourishing. Help all kids to learn the standards of conduct and discipline that'll make them successful in the world. An honest assessment of the impact of home life on students' performance and newly embracing the norm of a healthy, supportive home life is a great step to help children in schools. And last, outing reporter biases and agendas. Americans sensibly prefer straightforward honesty and authenticity from news sources. I don't care if you're liberal or conservative, just don't lie to me about who you are, what you believe, and why you're reporting on this story. For too long, Americans have been fed agenda-driven, yet agenda-hidden news reporting defiantly presented as objective fact. Efforts toward greater transparency on the biases and agendas of reporters is a step in the right direction. But petty, silly gossip about personal lives is not. Americans actually can figure out the difference. And that, my friends, is America Can We Talk for today. Please tune in every Monday through Thursday, 3 p.m. Central Time, right here to hear me, Debbie Georgatos, on the show America Can We Talk, which is dedicated to preserving and celebrating the unique, extraordinary greatness of America. Because as I always say, America matters. Talk to you tomorrow.
Like a crashing wave. Can you hear us now?
America Can We Talk? Truth about America.